Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about the params keyword. And so this is a really nice thing in C# that I haven't seen in certain languages, and it is something in C#. And so in order to kind of understand the power of this params keyword and the benefit, it helps to review a little bit of where we left off last week. And one of the last things that we talked about last week was this concept of overloaded methods. And if you remember the theory of an overloaded method, the theory is that you've got multiple methods that have the same identifier. In this case, the identifier is called add of our method name, and a different parameter list. And so there's different ways that you can overload methods, and I kind of highlight 3 different ways to overload your methods, being different data types of parameters, different quantity of parameters, and the different order of the data types. And so we kind of talked about these ways to overload methods. And really what does overloading methods do for us is that it makes our methods, in one word, flexible. Okay, so our methods, like this add method, is now more flexible on the inputs that it can take, right? Whether it takes 3 numbers or 4 numbers, or if it takes integers in, or if it takes doubles in. Like, really, the benefit, if there's one benefit, I would say that overloading methods makes them flexible. Okay? Introduce the params keyword. The params keyword, I mean, in this scenario, how many methods could we write called add? And you could add 2 numbers, and you could add 3 numbers, you could add 4 numbers, you could add 5 numbers. There's an infinite number of methods that you could overload called add, and just taking in 1,000 different potential ways of numbers. And so, yes, you can overload methods. Yes, this is a very common thing. However, there's one way to write a method, private, let's just say it returns an int, and it's called add, called params. We'll call it values. Okay, so first thing to notice, and we discussed it a little bit last week on how to write a method that accepts an array. And we covered a lot on Friday, but one of those topics that we covered was passing by reference. And one of the things that we passed by reference was an array, right? So we briefly showed how to write a method if I take out the params keyword. Now this method accepts an array of integers. And so we have briefly demonstrated this. I'm adding a keyword params to this method, and let me show kind of the benefit of doing this. Now, when we have an array that we're accepting as an input, we don't know how many elements are in that array, right? You could have an array of 5 elements, you could have an array of 10 elements, you could have an array of 100 elements, we don't know. And so, again, I said that making overloaded methods makes our methods flexible. So overloading makes our methods flexible. The params keyword is going to save us from writing 1,000 versions of the same kind of method, right? So it saves us from having to write 15 overloaded add methods, because this will accept any number of integers and store them in an array, and let's just return their sum. So here in sum, let me demonstrate. I'll start sum off at 0. Because we don't know how many elements are in our array, we just need to loop over them. Okay, now you can do a shorthand for each loop, or you could just do a regular for loop, because I think we're probably a little more used to seeing a for loop. I'm just going to do a standard for loop, and I'm going to do values.length. So hopefully by now we can all see that what we're doing is we're accepting an array coming into this method. So there's one input, it's an array of integers. Because we don't know the number of integers, we have to write a mechanism to account for that. We don't know if it's 1 int or 10 ints or 50 ints. So we're going to loop through all of our elements in our array using a standard for loop, and then I'll do sum plus equals values sub I. Right? So if there's one number, if there's 10 numbers, it doesn't really matter. It's going to loop over all the numbers. It's going to continually add them together into this variable called sum, and then I'm going to return sum. So now I have this params array that is very flexible. I've got this add method that's very flexible. It can accept all sorts of inputs. So let's check this out. So I'm going to kind of get rid of my comments here, and I'm just going to call add 1, 2, 3. So now this one method can accept, well, I just demonstrated I'm passing 3 different ints. These 3 ints are going to be passed into this values array. That values array will be looped over, added the sum together, return the sum, put that into the label. Of course, we should get 6 as our input. We should get 6 as our output, right? So this one method can take 3 inputs. It could take 4 inputs, right? Add them all together. It could take, again, we don't have to write 15 overloaded add methods. We write one add method that's very flexible. It can take any number of ints. Now, in addition to this, it can take individual integers, these 4 ints, store them in an array called values, pass them into this thing called values, loop over them, or because it's flexible, we could also do something like this. We can make an integer array called ints equals, and we could pass it. How about that? Right? So now we have an array. So not only does this add method accept individual integers, but you can also pass it an array. So in this case, I'm going to add my ints together, which is my array of 1s and 11. And so again, this one add method can take individual entries, or you could pass an array as well, right? So that's really how it's different than just passing an array. If we just passed it an array, well, then we couldn't do this other version where we added like that. Okay, so in short, this what's called params keyword, this params array, if you will, can set up one method that's very flexible to accept many kinds of inputs. Okay, the only, once you kind of understand that you don't know how many inputs, you're just going to loop over all the inputs. You got to work with your arrays that way. Another thing is, like, let's just say you can accept a double first now. So this 4.5 will go into X, right? And then you can have your params array, it has to basically be the last value in your method declaration. So notice my params array comes after declaring the double. Okay, you can't do it the other way around. So if I were to say double x here, notice that's not going to work, right? It's not going to compile. If you stop and think about it, that makes sense because it wouldn't know exactly when to stop taking these integers as inputs and then accept the double.
So you can't have two params.
And you cannot have two params. There can only be one params per method declaration. Right? So those are basically the two rules. You can only have one params array per method declaration, and it has to be the last parameter in your method signature. Okay? So again, benefit here, write one method. Now I could write another one, private double add that takes a params double called vals that does the same kind of thing, right? And that's totally fine. You write the same kind of logic. So this allows us to write one method. So there is a lab that asks you to declare a params array as part of its solution. So I wanted to cover this topic. Any questions on params array? Param arrays. All right, we'll stop here and we'll jump into some labs.